at your bulletin, you see that the new quarter has started, but you still got me. Bart asked me to cover this Sunday, and I'm glad because I wasn't through. I still had slides left. So we are going to finish up the book of Luke today, and then Bart will pick up with the book of John next week. Before we get started, let's have a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the many blessings that you give to us on a daily basis. And Father, we thank you so much for your Son who gave himself for us so that we might have the opportunity to live with you in heaven forever. Father, we thank you for your word that you have given to us so that we might know what our duties are, that we might know, learn about you, and that we might know how to be pleasing in your sight. Father, we pray that you would go with us as we go throughout this lesson this morning, that we would learn from it and be able to use it to better serve you. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen. We are in the final events that happen in the book of Luke, and I want to start out with a brief review of where we were last week. This was the last week of Jesus' earthly ministry, and it started out on him, the triumphal entry, coming in. When we finished up when we finished up last week, we were into Tuesday of that last week, and Jesus was teaching in the temple. This week and this morning, we'll see the very worst of man and the very best of God in this lesson this morning. So Jesus was teaching in the temple. At some point, he leaves the temple. As he's leaving the temple, one of the apostles says something about the decorations, because the Passover's coming, and there's some decorations there. They were talking about how beautiful the temple was. Then he started talking about the temple was going to be destroyed, and also Jerusalem as well. And they began to ask, what were going to be the signs of this. As Jesus continues to teach in the temple every day of this week, we see that the religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees, the different rulers from a religious standpoint go when they're trying to find ways of causing Jesus to say something that they could use against him, so they might be able to take him to the Romans and have him killed. Their desire was to get rid of him. They were tired of it. They didn't like their authority being challenged. They saw him as a threat to their way of life and this system that they had built up. And Jesus came and he was challenging what they had established, and they didn't like it because they feared that they might lose the support of the people. So they had to find a way of getting rid of him. So they set up a conspiracy to kill Jesus. And they tried over and over by direct confrontation to get him to say something in front of his followers, to try to get them to, that he would say something that might be disgusting to them, that they might turn and leave him. So they tried different things. They tried to get him to where he would question if it's lawful to pay taxes to the Romans. And he skillfully, on every turn, outwits those that are challenging him. And so they say, well, we got to figure out another way. Well, the way appeared, and it was one of his own. And it was Judas Iscariot, came to them and made a deal with them to that he would betray Jesus to them so that he could turn them over, or turn Jesus over to the religious leaders. It's time for the Passover meal. The Passover meal is prepared. They're in the upper room. They eat the Passover meal, and at the end of the Passover meal, Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper. And after he institutes the Lord's Supper, they begin to question themselves among themselves, who is going to be the greatest in this new kingdom that was coming, getting ready to be established. Someone had to make sure that the pecking order was correct. And so everybody was talking about who's going to be the greatest. And Jesus stops them and says, in this kingdom, you're not going to be, it's not like an earthly kingdom that you're thinking of. I'm looking for servants. And somewhere during this discussion, Judas leaves the upper room so that he can go and he can set in motion the plan to betray Jesus. And Jesus talks to Peter and tells Peter that Peter's going to deny Jesus 3 times, is going to deny him. But he says, once you've returned, I want you to strengthen the brethren, because those guys are going to be struggling too. Well, Peter couldn't believe Jesus was even saying this to him, because he was what he felt like was a faithful follower. He would never, ever leave Jesus. And Jesus said, before this night's over, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. It's probably just devastated Peter that Jesus had such a lack of trust in him. But Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen and was preparing Peter for the events of that evening. And that's where we ended last week. I want to pick up the story in verse 39. And we see the events of the Garden of Gethsemane, when all of a sudden the events, the things that are happening pick up, and they happen very rapidly as we go through the rest of this lesson. Begin in Luke chapter 22 and verse 39. It says, coming out, he went to the Mount of Olives, and as he was accustomed, and his disciples also followed him. When he came to the place, the Garden of Gethsemane, he said to them, pray that you may not enter into temptation. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Then an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Then he rose up from the prayer, and when he had rose up from the prayer and come to his disciples, he found them sleeping from sorrow. And then he said to them, why do you sleep? Rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation. So Jesus and his apostles, after leaving the upper room, they go outside of the city, and they're going to the Mount of Olives like he had done on previous nights, because he was not sleeping in Jerusalem. He was sleeping outside the city and would come into Jerusalem during the day. He stops at the Garden of Gethsemane, as was, as the text says, was his accustomed to doing during that week. He often went to the garden with his apostles. I have some pictures of the Garden of Gethsemane today, and you can see fairly thick. If you think about this garden, it's pretty good size. This was happening in the evening, It was dark, not a lot of light around. So finding somebody in this garden, if you didn't know exactly where they were going to be, was going to be difficult. Keep that in mind as the remainder of these next events unfold. So here we see that in this garden begins the darkest day of mankind, where man arrogantly and savagely killed the creator of the universe. But it was necessary for our sakes. They stop in the garden, and Jesus tells them to pray that you may not fall into temptation. They probably didn't understand what he meant. Jesus goes a little further, and he falls down, gets on his knees, and he prays. And Luke says that an angel appeared and strengthened Jesus. And he begins to pray so intensely that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. There's a lot going on that he is going through. And he prays to his Father to take this from him if there's any other way. But if there is no other way, your will be done. And so when he finishes praying, he returns to his apostles and he finds them sleeping. So he wakes them up and he tells them to pray lest you fall into temptation. Well, they probably didn't quite understand, again, what was going on. And about that same time, we see more events unfolding, beginning in verse 47. And while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When those around him, the apostles, saw what was going to happen, they said to him, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant, this is Peter, one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, permit even this. And he touched his ear and healed him. And then Jesus said to the chief priests and the captains of the temple and the elders who had come to him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. So we see it as Jesus is telling this to his apostles to pray. We see this multitude come. Judas is with them. They needed Judas to tell them where to go because it was dark. It was a good sized garden. They wanted to know. They didn't want to be trying to find him in the darkness. Judas led him right to him because he knew that's where Jesus would be. And so they needed Judas to identify which one of the people they were coming to find, which one was Jesus. And the signal was the one he kissed was going to be the one that they should arrest. But Jesus stopped him before he was able to do that. And he asked, are you betraying me with a kiss? He already knew what Judas's plans were. And I think it shocked Judas to realize that he'd been found out all along. He knew what was going to happen. So the apostles who were there said they saw what was getting ready to happen. They knew that Jesus was getting ready to be taken by force, and they were ready rise up and defend him so that Jesus might get away. In fact, Peter draws his sword and he strikes Malchus, one of the servants of the chief priest, cuts off his ear. Jesus does something extraordinary, I think, in the eyes of his apostles. He has Peter put away his sword, and he says, "Permit even this." I think Peter still didn't understand what was going on. And then Jesus heals the servant, and then he turns his attention to the chief priests and the captains who were there, and he said, the captains of the temple. And he asked them why they came out with swords and clubs like he was a thief or something. He says, "I was in the temple with you daily. Why didn't you try to seize me there?" Well, he knew the answer to that, and all of them did also. They were fearful of the people. And he says, "This is your hour and the power of darkness," which it was. Jesus is arrested and he is taken away. The apostles, no doubt, fearing for their own safety, scatter. But Peter follows at a distance as Jesus is taken first to the home of Annas, the high priest. Now, Annas was lawfully the high priest, or in the eyes of the people, he was the high priest. But the one that the Romans had put in place, probably because he paid for the position, was Caiaphas. And Caiaphas happened to be Annas' son-in-law. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes, is why did John says, why did Judas have to actually give a signal? Why didn't they? They'd already seen Jesus before. At least this week, they'd seen him every day in the temple. Why did they need him to give a positive idea of who Jesus was? He should have known. I don't know how dark it was in there. I don't know how close they were to him. Maybe if they would just arrested everybody, they might maybe pick him out, which one it was. I don't know exactly. So, but yeah, we live in an age where there's a lot of tools that we have available to us that were not available in those days. Yeah, Dennis says that in Isaiah 53, it says that there was nothing in Jesus' appearance that would make him, stand out in a crowd. So anyway, so he was identified, he was arrested, and Peter begins to follow at a distance. They take him first to Annas' house, and Peter, standing outside, is struggling with a lot of things at this point. He's trying to make sense of what just happened in front of him. He knows that Jesus is in grave danger, and he feels helpless to rescue him. He's probably wondering why Jesus made him put away his sword and then allowed himself to be taken away without a struggle. And what was going to happen with this kingdom that he kept talking about. If Jesus was going to be killed, possibly, what would happen to this kingdom that he had been talking about? And if he was killed, what was going to happen next? And what would happen to the apostles? Were they going to be the next ones that would be also rounded up and killed as well? So all these things were playing out in Peter's mind, and he is confronted by a servant girl who announces that Peter was one of Jesus' followers, and he immediately denies it. Strike one. Someone else recognizes Peter as one of them, but one of those that were with Jesus, and Peter denies it again. Strike two. An hour or so later, another person confidently announces that Peter is one that he had seen Peter with Jesus. And Peter again denies it immediately. And this is strike three. And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered what Jesus had said only a short time before, just in the space of only a few hours. And he went out and he wept bitterly. And in the meantime, as all this is playing out, Jesus is at the house of Annas. And he is faced with the first of 6 trials. Now, I say trials. We call these trials. These people are really not looking for justice here. These are interrogations, not trials. There's nothing legal about what's going on here. But again, just be aware of that as we go through this. He faces the first of 6 trials that he would endure before his crucifixion. At the house of Annas, Jesus is mocked and he's beaten. They place a blindfold on him and they slap him and they say, "Which one of us? Tell us which one of us slapped you." And Luke records that many things were blasphemously spoken against Jesus at the home of Annas. And Jesus is then taken before the Sanhedrin. If you look at some of the other Gospels, it says that he was taken to Caiaphas and tried by Caiaphas and then by the Sanhedrin. The way the Luke records it is that he's taken to the council, to the Sanhedrin. If you look at Matthew's account, Matthew says that they went to Caiaphas, and where the elders and the scribes were assembled. But Caiaphas most likely led this proceeding. They were looking for a confession. They were looking for something that they could use against him, because this is more of a dress rehearsal. Their intent is to take him to Pilate, because they had no ability in themselves to offer up a death penalty. It had to go to Pilate before they could do that. So these were really practice runs trying to establish a case or make a case against Jesus, something that would stick so that they could use it against him. And so they go and they begin to question Jesus. And they said, "If you're the Christ, tell us." And Jesus, they wanted him to be the one that was going to say it. Jesus responded and he told them that you wouldn't believe it if I told you. And if I ask you, you won't answer. And you won't let me go either. And he continues, and from now on, I will sit on the right hand of the power of God. Paraphrasing that. And so they asked, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus responded, "You rightly say that I am." In essence, yes, I am. They felt that this was a strong enough case that they could take this to Herod or to Pilate to get a conviction. So they have the information. They think that they have enough for a case, and they take Jesus before Pilate, still early in the morning. They take Jesus to Pilate, and they begin to give the charges that Jesus is being, list out the charges against him. They say that he was they began to accuse him, to charge him with sedition, that he was agitating the people, that he was encouraging others to not pay taxes, and he was assuming the title of king. They were hoping that Pilate would listen to these things, and that would be enough to convict him. The other Gospels tell us that Pilate was trying to get out of this completely. Burton Kaufman said of these charges, he says, "By the sheer power of morality and intellect, Jesus at last forced the officials of the Hebrews into using the only charge that he would permit them to use, namely his claim to be the divine Messiah. That was the issue Jesus chose to seal with the blood of the cross." So he goes before Pilate. They begin to accuse him. Pilate, not necessarily on either side here, he goes and he asks Jesus, "Are you a king?" And he says, "It is as you say." Well, Herod, Anthony Ashe says in his commentary, said that Pilate knew that the Jews would follow a king and not deliver him up to the Romans if they believed that he was in fact a king. So that charge was false as it was. If Jesus was what the Sanhedrin claimed he was, they would have followed him to the death. So he was not believing that. And Pilate declares that Jesus is innocent. He says, I find no fault in him. Well, they were not happy about this. They argued that he stirred up the people in Judah, beginning in Galilee. Well, as soon as Pilate heard that Jesus was from Galilee, he realized that's Herod's jurisdiction. I may have a way out of this and not have to make a decision. So he sends Jesus to Herod. And Jesus goes before Herod. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad. Not because he wanted to hear something that Jesus had to say and maybe actually believe what he had to say. He looked at Jesus as a curiosity. He had hoped to see him so that he might see him do a miracle. He wanted to be entertained. He didn't want to be enlightened by Jesus. He came and he sat down and talked to him, and he asked Jesus a lot of questions. But Jesus wouldn't give him any answers. The religious leaders who would come there also tried their best to accuse him of different things. Now, Herod was really just a terrible guy. He was brutal, very vindictive, very. It was one of those guys that you had to be careful with. Here's Jesus in front of Herod, and Herod, after he listened to these proceedings, after they accused him, he said that he found nothing worthy of death. And so he, being Herod, the kind of guy he is, that wasn't enough. So he roughed him up. There were some things that he did to Jesus. The men beat him, and they treated him with contempt, and they put this robe on him, and they dressed him up, and then they sent him back to Pilate. And the text says that Pilate and Herod became political allies or political friends on that same day. So Jesus heads off once again for another trial. He goes before Pilate again. And Pilate assembles the religious leaders together. One thing I failed to mention was that this was all being done outside where Pilate was. The Jews felt like they were, because it was so close to the Passover, they couldn't go inside the Praetorium because that's where Gentiles, that's where Pilate worked and lived. They didn't go in there because it might defile them before the Passover. They couldn't see themselves going inside there. So this was done outside. There was a certain seat that Pilate would sit on as he would listen to things that were brought to him in his dealings with the Jews. And so this is done outside. I always thought that as Jesus was being tried here, that it was everybody was there and everybody turned against Jesus. But that's not the case. This area is only going to hold a certain amount of people. And so a great number of those people that were there were ones that were against him anyway. The majority of the people that had come to Jerusalem for the Passover probably didn't know this was going on as it was happening. They might have risen up and changed this. But as I was reading through this, I realized that you can only fit a certain number of people in this space, and that was the ones that were the most vocal against Jesus. So Pilate pronounces he begins these proceedings by announcing that he found no fault in Jesus when he brought him to me before. I sent him to Herod. Herod didn't find anything that was worthy of death either. What are we doing here? And so they were trying to, again, accuse him. And Pilate says, okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. I find that this guy is innocent on all these charges that you're accusing him of. So what I'll do is I'll chastise him. That sounds like a kind of, chastise doesn't sound like that bad. What he was saying is, I'm going to beat him half to death, this innocent man, to pacify you, and then I'll release him. Because during that Passover time, there was a custom of the Jews that they release a guilty person, and they would release a guilty person at that point. So that wasn't enough for them. They wanted him to release Barabbas. Barabbas was the guy who was a murderer, one who stirred up a rebellion in Judah and had the penalty of death on his head. This terrible criminal was the one they wanted to release. They wanted to release him instead of Jesus. Pilate, again, now Pilate is not the good guy in this. If you, as you start reading through this, you might get the idea that he really was trying to look out for Jesus' best interest. Oh no, Pilate was looking out for Pilate, because the last thing a politician wanted to be remembered for was something that was bad. He wanted to be remembered for all the good things he did. There probably wasn't a very long list of good things he did, but he didn't want to have this on his resume when he went up to his next appointment. So he was trying to find a way out of this. He did not want to do this. He wanted someone else to bear the burden for this. But he couldn't really see a way out. They kept going and trying to force him into a decision. And they began to tell him they want to crucify him. And he says, what evil has he done? And they really didn't come up with anything that he could legally be charged with. All they really wanted to do was they want him to be crucified. And this is this mob of people in this area, and that's all that Pilate sees. And he yields to this mob, and he allows Jesus to first be scourged, if you go to John's account. And we don't have time to talk about the terrible things that are involved in a scourging. Jesus is scourged, and then we see that the guilty is released and the innocent is condemned. And Jesus is taken to be crucified. In Luke chapter 23, 26 through 49, we read about the crucifixion of Jesus, and we see that as they're going out of the city, because they didn't do this inside the city, had to be taken outside the city to do this, a man named Simon is compelled to carry Jesus' cross. It's probably that cross beam, and it was in no way light. It was a pretty heavy piece of wood. Jesus, after being beaten, after all the things he had suffered that night, was not able to bear it, and they had someone else carry it for him. Multitudes followed him, this procession out, and the women along the way began to mourn and have about Jesus. And Jesus tells them not to worry about him. Don't cry for me. Cry for your children, because as he goes through, he's talking about, again, the destruction of Jerusalem that was going to be happening in about 40 years. We see that Jesus is crucified between two criminals, and this scene is going on around him. You have Jesus in the middle. You have two criminals one on each side. There are I always picture a kind of a carnival kind of atmosphere of these people who are so glad this is finally happening, but you also have those people that are mourning because this is also happening, but they have no power to change it. And we see the religious leaders mocking Jesus as he's hanging there on the cross, and there are others who are casting lots for his clothes. One of the criminals says to Jesus, they began to have to talk, and one says, "Save yourself and save us too, and if you're the Christ." And the other one says, basically, you need to stop saying stuff like that. We're getting what we deserve. Jesus hasn't done anything to deserve this. And then he asks Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom. And Jesus tells him, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." And from about noon that day until 3 in the afternoon, it is completely dark as the creator of our universe is crucified by the creation. I just always thought that was such a travesty that the person that created all this was being killed by the ones who he had created. And Jesus dies on the cross, And the centurion, seeing what is going on, he glorifies God. And the crowd and the friends and the women begin to mourn at his death. Jesus is buried. And it's an interesting point here is that there's a person named Joseph of Arimathea. He goes in an act of just courage, goes to Pilate and he asks for Jesus' body. Joseph was a member of the council. He was openly proclaiming to everybody by doing this that he was a follower of Jesus. Joseph was also accompanied by a guy named Nicodemus. Nicodemus was one who also was a member of the council who had come to Jesus at night to learn. Joseph of Arimathea also came to Jesus in secret to hear him. Both were followers. Both decided this was the point that they were going to take a stand for Jesus, and they went and they took his body. I can see it gently taking it from the cross, taking it to this tomb that belonged to Nicodemus, and preparing the body for burial. They wrapped his body in linen. They also used spices that Nicodemus had brought, about 100 pounds, it says, of spices to prepare his body. And they probably had to do this in a hurried kind of a fashion because the Passover was coming. It was getting ready to be dark, and their day started at sunset. So they did this. They rolled a stone. The stone gets rolled back, and these women who accompanied Jesus from Galilee watched as where he was laid, because they had a plan. The next day they were going to come back and they were going to, the day after the Sabbath, they were going to take these spices and these fragrant oils, and they were going to go ahead and finish the job that Joseph and Nicodemus had started. And then they go and they observe the Sabbath. And then the next day, which would have been a Sunday morning, these women come back to the tomb, and they find the stone rolled away. What had started out as the darkest day of man, we have a dawn of a new day for mankind, because Jesus, whom they killed, had risen from the grave. A glorious day that we should always celebrate. And we don't have time for the rest of my slides, but we see that the women rush back. They go and they tell the others about what had happened. Of course, they're not believed because they're women, and women's testimony was not deemed credible. And so Peter runs back to the tomb to see for himself, and he sees the tomb empty, and he doesn't quite understand, or he's not sure what has happened. And so Jesus, later on in that day, two men are going are taking the road to Emmaus. Jesus is walking alongside of them and joins in their conversation that they're having. And for some time, they're talking about the things that are going on or had gone on. That always happens to me. Anyway, this will finish our study. Go ahead and finish out the book if you would like in your own time. Thank you so much. Bart will be with us this coming Sunday to begin the book of John. Thank you so much.